Kamal, a special edition of the Daily Tea today from the Excel Centre in London. We are at the ARC conference, surrounded by righties in your favourite place. What does ARC stand for, Kamal?
I thought you were going to ask me that, but luckily it's above my left shoulder there. The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. It's actually one of those groups that is growing and growing on the intellectual right who are taking the fight to liberals all around the world.
Who would have thought it? Right now have the momentum. And we're going to be speaking to three key figures on the right, so do keep listening because you're in for quite an exciting ride. We're going to be speaking to Michael Gove, now the editor of the Spectator magazine, formerly a minister in practically every government department, leading Brexiteer, one-time nemesis of Boris Johnson. Also going to be speaking to my old buddy, Kevin Roberts, who's one of Donald Trump's besties from the Heritage Foundation.
And Ayan Hirsi Ali, a very brave woman who has written and spoken passionately about why Islamism is such a threat.
Welcome to the Daily Tea from the ARC conference with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed. So Camilla, this time last year, the ARC conference had about 1,200 delegates. This year, it's got over 4,000. There is a really interesting debate in the United Kingdom where the right is making all the arguments and the left is really struggling to say what it is about. And you really feel an energy here. The only time I felt an energy similar to this is at the reform conferences. There's this sort of buzziness. They started with Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. There was sort of, it's alive.
Yes.
And I think that for those people who will be very critical of some of the ideas discussed here, they talk about the end of the global rules-based order, the necessity of Christian-based morals, they talk about family, community, flag and nation. Lots of people might find some of those arguments uncomfortable, but you cannot deny the energy and where the momentum is presently sitting.
Yeah, so what was once considered quite fringy has now become mainstream because Donald Trump has basically given it all rocket fuel. And it's interesting, isn't it? How on earth is Keir Starmer in power in the UK when you consider that the momentum, ironic to use that phrase about the right, but the momentum is certainly behind the right. And once again here, Nigel Farage making his mark more than Kemi Badenoch, which is unfortunate because the Conservative leader was here on Monday, first day of the conference. She gave a speech. It was a good speech about freedom of speech and the importance of rescuing civilization basically from liberal wokery. Got completely drowned out by all of the news about Ukraine. And then Nigel Farage takes to the stage today, gives a quite barnstorming performance, and now everyone's just talking about reform again, on the back of some quite good polling for the party as well.
Absolutely. So reform today, I was eagerly WhatsApped by a reform official this morning with the latest YouGov poll, which had reform on 27, Labour on 25, and the Conservatives on 21. So reform are in the lead, a party that hardly existed, 2 years ago, which is really incredible. And then, as you say, Nigel Farage comes here today, a day when he can command a little bit more of the headlines. He spoke about two things. It wasn't questioned on Ukraine, which was a bit disappointing for us journalists, I suppose, but nevertheless, it wasn't about that. He was interviewed by Jordan Peterson. He was asked about two big subjects. The first of those was energy. And Nigel Farage made it clear he doesn't actually care about what people say is climate change.
The one thing that drives me absolutely potty is when I hear that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. That's what they tell us. That clearly is absolutely nuts. Now, there are times in our past when CO2 in the atmosphere has been much, much higher than it is today, and that's before people drove 4x4 Chelsea tractors. So I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you whether CO2 is leading to warming or not, but there are so many other massive factors. And Jordan, I was told that of all the CO2 that's produced every year in the world, only 3 to 5% of it is produced by mankind. So we do, as you rightly say, need to get this debate into a sense of perspective. And I sometimes think that the carbon dioxide hysteria has actually blinded us to other environmental disasters that are going on, such as the rape of our oceans and many other things. I'm an environmentalist in the old school sense and definition of that term. bit more common sense. That's what we need.
Okay.
And then there's actually quite a funny moment. A lot of the terminology around art is around this idea of family and that people need to have more babies and that heterosexual couples are the norm and should be encouraged. And then Jordan Peterson asked Nigel Farage this question, to which he got quite an amusing answer.
You know, you could make the case that stable, committed monogamy, heterosexual, child-centered monogamy, is the kind of long-term commitment to community, to sacrifice, and to future that's the fundamental unit of civilized society. And so I'm curious, Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, I may not necessarily be the best advocate for monogamous heterosexuality or stable marriage, having been divorced twice. But do I think family matters? Jordan, on the 3rd of June last year, as I was coming into London by car to go back into politics, having left it a few years before, my ambition was to get the United Kingdom to be a self-governing, independent nation. And for many, many years, I was pretty much on my own fighting that battle. The day we left the European Union, I thought, right, I've done my job. And that day on the 3rd of June, when I was coming back, thinking, well, this really rather comfortable, lovely life I've got is about to disappear, I thought, why am I doing it? And I came up with 3 words: family, community, and country. They're the things that matter to me above absolutely everything.
What Farage gets so right, which Kemi Badenoch still hasn't found and Keir Starmer finds impossible, is the ability to sum up a message in 3 words. That idea of family, community, country. That's what he is, that's what he does, the public get it.
Inevitably, of course, he was asked whether he would ever do a deal with the Conservatives, be it a pre-election deal, a post-election coalition, and he had this interesting response, which we will put to Michael Gove in just a moment.
First things first, the right is not split in this country. The Conservative Party is not on the right in any measurable way. 14 years that brought us the highest tax burden since 1947, 14 years that saw mass immigration, legal mass immigration on a scale hitherto never even dreamt of, 14 years that saw illegal immigration, small boats crossing the channel, and the government completely incapable of dealing with it because they couldn't face up to what membership of the European Convention on Human Rights was all about. And 14 years that saw net zero enshrined into law by a Conservative government and Boris Johnson, Theresa May, as evangelical about net zero as the current Ed Miliband.
Welcome. First interview with you. Delighted to have you here. And we're going to get you to react, first of all, to something that Nigel Farage said earlier in this conference hall. He was asked whether there would be any kind of hookup on the right, whether he could do a deal with the Conservatives. And he said, there isn't a split on the right because the Conservatives aren't right-wing. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that Nigel is displaying the characteristic braggadocio which has catapulted him to the forefront of the nation's consciousness over the last 20 years. The truth is that the Conservative Party is a classic centre-right party, and Reform is an insurgent force, and Nigel, as an insurgent, will want to do everything he can to say that the established brand is tarnished, and that he is, if not the only, certainly the superior game in town. But that's politics.
And what about the latest polling by YouGov, which puts Reform now on 27%, 2 points ahead of Labour on 25%, the Tories on 21%, seemingly facing a little bit of an existential crisis under Kemi Badenoch? Or am I being over-dramatic, Michael?
No, not in the least. You've got a podcast which requires, as most podcasts do, the melodramatic intonation and the deployment of polling figures in order to create the sense of Sturm und Drang that draws listeners to the Daily Tea. But again, I think it's just important to put things in perspective. So it's entirely understandable when Labour have had a truly torrid first 8 months, that people, having ejected the Conservatives with great force and efficiency just over 9 months ago, have the public have entirely understandably thought, well, the most effective way of signalling our discontent with what's going on at the moment is to vote for that insurgent force, to vote for reform. But we're several years away from a general election. A lot can happen in that intervening period. And I think Kemi Badenoch, when she was here yesterday, made the point that between the sort of the anger which populist parties are adept at exploiting, and also the sense of disempowerment in the face of global forces, which many on the liberal left seem to be captured by, there is an appetite for realistic, answer-based, pragmatic policymaking, and that's what the Conservative Party has always provided.
Kemi Badenoch has been seen as one of your protégés, Michael. You've been someone who's always supported her. Do you think this slightly slower approach to how she wants to rebuild the Conservatives is not simply going to be washed away by the noise from reform? And by the time the Conservatives come out and say, this is what we want to do, reform will be so far ahead, so far over the horizon, that it'll be too late.
Well, it's very flattering for you to invoke me as sort of the person for whom Kemi has been a protégé. Kemi is a formidable person in her own right. She's nobody's protégé, nobody's puppet. And anyone who knows her will know she makes her own mind up on issues. She is not anyone who can be pushed around or, suborned in any way. But the whole point about political tides is that they ebb and flow. So there is no such thing as an impregnable lead in the polls. At the last election, Labour won a massive majority, but as we all know, that majority was well described as a sandcastle majority, one that is being swept away by the tide of events. So it's certainly the case that there's an interest in reform, there's an interest in insurgent parties across the West. But come general elections, it's important for political parties to have not just a rhetorical assault against the established government, they've also got to have worked out policies and answers to the difficult questions that we face. So, for example, in Germany at the moment, the party in the lead, the CDU, Friedrich Merz's party, is a party that has a series of worked out answers to the challenges that Germany faces. And I think it's also been the case that we've seen in previous periods in British history that there have been insurgent forces like the SDP and so on, which were leading in the polls in the early 1980s, ahead of both Labour and the Conservatives then, but Margaret Thatcher ended up winning the 1983 election, and indeed Labour saw off the challenge from the Liberal SDP alliance. So it's a mistake to translate a moment in time as an epochal event that changes politics forever.
It's really interesting being here. The big arguments about diversity, equity and inclusion policies. The big arguments about immigration. And Camilla and I were just chatting before you arrived with us, Michael, that when you look back, the explosion of immigration, the explosion of DEI policies, we've got a piece in the Telegraph today showing a graph post-COVID of DEI policies, both in the public sector and the private sector. Both of these two huge issues happened under the Conservatives.
And transgenderism.
And transgender rights. I find it astonishing that the Conservatives, a Conservative government of which you were part, can now be blamed by the voters for being the reason why there is this backlash.
So there are three things. The first thing is there is a conceit that believes that everything that happens in our society can be controlled or stopped by government. So there are broader social forces that have been happening across the West, the rise of what has been called woke politics, and it's affected jurisdictions where you've had Conservatives, Liberals and Socialists in charge. It's how parties respond to those challenges which tells you whether or not they're capable of meeting them. And that takes me back again to Kemi Badenoch. The leadership that she showed on the gender issue. At a time when Keir Starmer was unable to define exactly what a woman was, Kemi Badenoch was the person who challenged the legislation that the Scottish Government were bringing forward, which would have allowed male rapists in women's jails. And it was as a result of her leadership that she built a broad coalition that included people like J.K. Rowling to turn the tide there. The broader question about how one deals with diversity, equity and inclusion, and the way in which people are placed into particular identity boxes and judged on that basis rather than on their merits or their values, that particular challenge has been better addressed by Kemi Badenoch, I think, than by anyone in British politics. Migration, you do have a powerful point. It was the case that migration was far too high in the latter years of the Conservative government. There are some reasons some extenuating circumstances, but again, it has been the case that Kemi Badenoch has pointed out that if we want not only to reduce the flow of people coming into this country, but also to deal with the stock of people who've arrived here and who are currently enjoying indefinite leave to remain, if we want to stop them getting full citizenship, then she has answers in a way that no other party does.
When it comes to the governability of Great Britain, I mean, you were in the Cabinet Office for quite a stretch. That's kind of the engine room of government, really. It's been this growing sense, and we've seen it over in America, Trump railing against the so-called establishment, the blob, having to issue all of these executive orders so that he can gain back control of his own country. We had Liz Truss making a similar criticism. She was pulling on a lever in one direction. She felt like the civil service was pulling it in the opposite direction. Is your sense, having been in government for such a long time, that politicians have lost control, not just of the civil service, but also you'll have seen the coverage in the Telegraph about the judiciary interpreting laws in their own way, which seem to be against the wishes of the people that elect our politicians? It seems like we've lost some control somewhere.
You can exercise control. It's not easy, but you absolutely can. So it requires determination, a plan, and political coherence in order to do so. So we changed education policy during the coalition years. We managed to get Britain out of the European Union in the aftermath of those years, and using some of our Brexit powers, we were able to transform the way in which, for example, we support farmers and enhance the environment. All of these things can be done if you have a will. Now, of course, it is the case that you have a more activist judiciary than ever before. And if you have a supporter of judicial activism within the government, as Attorney General, as Richard Hermer is, effectively putting manners on ministers and telling them that they can't proceed because he wants to wag a legal finger at them, then you won't get change. But if you have a Prime Minister, as David Cameron was and as Boris Johnson was, who is determined to ensure that important policies are delivered, then you can deliver. Anyone who was in the room during the period in the run-up to the 2019 Brexit deal, when Boris's team was working the EXO room on the execution of our departure from the European Union, would have seen how you can take Whitehall, take that machine and drive it effectively. The problem is, and I think this touches on our previous conversation, on the one hand, you have at the moment a Labour government that is incoherent and doesn't know where it wants to drive the machine, and you also have on the other side some voices on the right that are clear about the direction in which they wish to go, but what they don't have is an understanding of how to drive that machinery, or certainly they haven't exhibited it so far.
You mentioning education, sorry, Kamal, I was just going to ask this one question. You mentioning education there and then Brexit reminded me of Dominic Cummings, who used to work with you, great man. And he has suggested today that Donald Trump should help to intervene in bringing the Conservatives and Reform together in the interests of keeping Starmer out for another 4 years. What's your reaction to that and the idea of them eventually working together?
Well, even Homer nods, even Dom can get things wrong. And so I think it's Donald Trump's role to safeguard America's interests, and it's the Conservative Party's role to offer answers and alternative to this government. And I think all of this talk of sort of brokering deals is beside the point. It's very much of interest, understandably, to the political classes, but what I think, I hope anyway, the broader country wants, what Daily Telegraph and Spectator readers want, are detailed answers to the difficult challenges that we face. To be fair to Daily Telegraph and Spectator readers, at the moment they don't much care where those answers come from. But what they want to see are ways of dealing with all of the problems that you identified. They want to know what is required in order to ensure that we can secure control of our borders. And they're open to, as I say, people from whatever background coming forward with propositions. But I think they're more interested in that than in the precise positioning of politicians in the SW1 pecking order.
If I'm hearing you correctly, you don't think that Kemi Badenoch should entertain any deal with reform?
Well, I think that talking about deals is a diversion from the real work that Kemi Badenoch, or for that matter anyone in politics, should be concentrating on. Talking about deals is an attempt to say to the public, you know, don't worry your pretty little heads about policy. We'll fix all that. We will come together, come under this tent, come under this banner, join us in this new alliance, coalition, whatever. What politicians should be doing is seeking to win a battle of ideas rather than trying to win a war of position. And ultimately, the best ideas will win out. So it's fascinating. I'm fascinated by politics. I'm not going to suggest for a moment that I don't read Dom's blogs or Daily Telegraph columnists when they discuss the whys and wherefores of what's happening in Westminster positioning. Of course I'm interested, but I'm more interested in the broad policy questions, where the government is failing and what the best alternative would be.
Opposition leaders often struggle when there are very significant foreign policy issues which involve prime ministers and presidents and leaders of nations. Kemi Badenoch was here yesterday, as you said. She spoke. It was a bit overwhelmed. It was a little overwhelmed by what was happening, obviously, in Ukraine. How do you think Kemi Badenoch should respond to the idea that it seems now likely, with Trump's backing, that Vladimir Putin, an autocratic dictator that has invaded a sovereign nation, will gain land in any type of deal with Ukraine or with Donald Trump? What is her role there, and how should she come out and be strongly backing Ukraine, or should she be pro-deal?
I think analysing how we got here is the most important thing in learning lessons. I don't think any of us can be happy with the current situation. I think you are right that there is a real risk that Russian aggression will be rewarded in a deal that cedes 20% of Ukraine's sovereign territory to Vladimir Putin, who is a mass murderer and a gangster. The question has to be, why did we find ourselves in that position? And it's easy to blame Donald Trump, but we need to look at both the reasons why warnings were not heeded about Putin's intentions, and we also need to consider the role that Ukraine's allies, European nations in particular, played. Was it the case that we willed the end, Ukraine's victory, without supplying the means? I think it was. So rather than now trying to award a sort of a thumbs up or a thumbs down to each of the players, it is better to analyse what went wrong, and then on the basis of that analysis come up with conclusions about the type of foreign policy and security decisions that we should be making now. And I think one of those conclusions is that we're living in a world of realist foreign policy, and that means that the fond illusions that people have had that the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court is going to keep the peace need to be dispensed with, and an investment in defence and hard power is the answer.
Michael Gove, former Cabinet Minister, editor of The Spectator, thank you for joining us on The Daily Tea.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Thank you, Kamal. Love listening to The Daily Tea, almost as good as Coffee House Shots.
You're allowed that little plug for our rival. Thank you, Michael.
Well, he's certainly a 100% card-carrying member of the Kemi Badenoch Society.
He is, and also he's just so good, isn't he? I mean, if you compare him to the current crop of Cabinet Ministers that at times struggle to put a sentence together, Michael Gove gives a masterclass in handling media effectively. So funny that his now gone? Has he gone to the dark side now as a journalist, or did he come from the dark side? Can't quite decide, Kamal.
No, we're glad to welcome him back as a journalist,
Exactly,
where he started
where he
his
first
career,
started.
I believe, in Aberdeen on the Press and Journal.
Aberdeen, indeed. Well, we've spoken about Trump on a domestic level there with Michael Gove, but let's now speak to the Trump whisperer. I think we can call him that, Kevin Roberts. He's the president of the Heritage Foundation, and I started by asking him whether his Project 2025, which he had claimed on the Daily Tea would be the blueprint for Trumpism, has actually been more influential than even he had planned. So you are massively influencing government policy right now.
I think that remains to be seen. It may just be a coincidence. And what I mean by that is Donald Trump deserves 100% of the credit for what his administration is doing. And I mean that with no sarcasm. Vice President Vance, who set the world afire with his reality check for European elites a few days ago, deserves all this credit. To the extent that Heritage and the 110 other conservative groups in the United States who participated in our project might have offered some air cover, might have offered some policy recommendations, personnel recommendations, it is up to the president and vice president about whether they take those. I want to be really clear. They deserve all the credit because they've taken all the risk. We on the outside serve the American people, who are the people who are taking a victory lap right now because of the courage of President Trump.
Although, weirdly, he kind of distanced himself from Project 2025 and said it was at one point abysmal, I haven't read it, and yet recommendations like scrap DEI, he makes an executive order almost on day one and follows precisely the blueprint that you set him. So aren't you being a bit modest?
The ideas that my colleagues and our friends across the conservative movement came up with are the best in the world. I won't be modest about those because their work is impeccable and it's outstanding. When President Trump distanced himself from our project in the political campaign, it made perfect sense to us because at the time, as you remember, the radical left gave us about $1 billion in earned media trying to turn this into a boogeyman. So it made perfect sense as he's trying to win a campaign that he didn't want that liability. But it also makes perfect sense that now these ideas are ascendant, not just in the United States, but across Europe for this reason. The American people and everyday Brits and Europeans, I might add, are tired of elites telling them that they're going to concentrate power. So ultimately what Trump is doing is providing his own blueprint. Maybe some of our ideas have been very helpful. Maybe some of our people have been very helpful. But he's providing the blueprint for how you decentralize that power and give it back to the American people.
Kevin, are there any risks in the pace of change that you are putting in place? USAID, for example, all those programs being cut so rapidly, DEI being cut so rapidly. Many people obviously agree with that program, but the rapidity means that, let's just take it domestically in the US, the impacts could be really negative for many people who at the moment are recipients of some of that aid. Do you worry about, not hubris maybe, but the pace of change?
No. In fact, the only risk is the mental health of liberals and wax museum conservatives who've gotten so drunk on power for 50 years that only they are concerned about the pace, because the American people have been beset with record inflation because of the Biden-Harris regime. The American people have not been able to start businesses at the pace they would like to start businesses because of the over-regulatory state. The American people have seen an utter lack of moral clarity by the former American president, Mr. Biden, as our British friends know well when it comes to foreign policy and international strength. And so this pace is exactly what's needed, not just to save America, but dare I say, save the West.
Tell us a bit about foreign policy and where Trump wants to position America. In terms of economy, some have said quite isolationist, tariffs to protect the UK economy, the US economy and US workers. On the world stage, controversy around Ukraine. If, given the way that Trump has spoken about it, Vladimir Putin is able to invade a sovereign nation and gain territory and keep that territory, that surely goes against all the values of Western liberal democracies, that a dictator should not be able to succeed in that way.
Mr. Putin is evil, to state the obvious, and yet it's a false dichotomy to say that the choice facing the United States or the West is either the radical interventionism that we've seen over the last 25 or 35 years or isolationism. And to your first question, the path that Mr. Trump is paving, and we're fully supportive of at Heritage, is a more restrained position where America is strong, it's its defense forces are the most lethal, the most efficient, the most updated to fight the next war, which will be with China most likely, not Russia. But on your very fair question about Russia, ultimately the Ukraine war was never winnable for the Ukrainians. I don't celebrate that fact. That's something that I deeply lament. I find it very tragic because of the evil that Mr. Putin has perpetrated upon the Ukrainians. And yet, what we've been told by so many elites in the West was that it was winnable and it was worth Americans sending $260 billion of their precious resources when we have $36 trillion in debt. And the war was never winnable. And so what Trump is doing is being a realist. There will be very severe repercussions on Mr. Putin for what he's done, to get to the heart of your very fair question. And I think when we see that this peace resolution comes as a result of Trump's leadership, the world will say, this is the best scenario that we can implement right now. And hopefully it gives the Ukrainians an opportunity to take a realistic stock of something Brussels elites don't want us to do. And that is the corruption that persists in Mr. Zelensky's government. Heritage, for example, publishes an index of economic freedom in which Ukraine has persistently ranked in the bottom 10 when it comes to transparency. There are real, not just opportunities, but pressing needs for Ukraine to attend to its own affairs. A growing percentage of Ukrainians want this war to end as well.
What does Europe need to do to ensure that Europe is in a better place and not sitting under the security umbrella of America?
Two things. The first is to pull their own weight. The United Kingdom does that, and so take that as a very friendly reminder from an American friend. But there are other European nations, particularly Germany and France, who don't pull their own weight. They like to tell everyone else what to do, but they don't themselves spend the requisite percentage of their GDP on defense. But the second thing is, and this really isn't apropos of anyone in Britain other than your prime minister, and that is, don't come to the United States and wag your finger at American conservatives, because we've saved your asses plenty of times in wars. Pull your own damn weight, do your own defense, and America will be your best friend. That's how you should understand Trump.
And will he be equally tough talking on Gaza? We've heard his Make Gaza Great Again plan. It's been received with a degree of skepticism in the Western world. What do you think, how do you think that is going to actually play out in reality? Because we already witnessed a bit of a White House climb down, this sense to which Palestinians would be expunged to other nations, including Jordan and Egypt. And then the White House came back and said, no, that's not what the president meant. He meant that they should temporarily move out, he'll rebuild Gaza, and then they can come back. What's the truth of the matter?
Well, details certainly are undetermined, and I don't know what those ultimate details will be. The administration does, but a little bit of translation of this for our British friends, and that is, Trump is trying to reframe the narrative. He's trying to reframe the narrative from a two-state solution, which is an utter fiction. It's a fiction in terms of historical reality, it's a fiction in terms of political feasibility, and this is Trump resetting the terms of the debate so that everyone involved ultimately is going to be treated with fairness and dignity. One thing I will tell you as someone who knows President Trump, in spite of all of the mostly negative press that he gets from other outlets in Europe, is this: he loves every person on this planet. He believes in the dignity of every person on this planet. And I actually think the reframing of this narrative about what to do with Gaza actually will ultimately benefit everyone, including those who are living there now.
Kevin Roberts, thank you so much for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thank you. Good old Kevin, who is playing down massively there how much influence Project 2025 has had. I mean, I appreciate that the president did distance himself, but the ideology of the movement has absolutely been embraced by Trump when he has signed all those executive orders. I mean, maybe the heritage just represents a certain kind of right-wing thinking that he's managed to channel in a political sense into the first 4 weeks of his administration.
What is really clear is that you need a blueprint. You need something that you can at least work to, and given that so many people who wrote some chapters in Project 2025 are now senior figures in the administration, for example, the head of the CIA, is a really important signal about the work in the UK that Nigel Farage needs to do for reform and Kemi Badenoch needs to do for the Conservatives. You need a document which is your working proposal for what you'll do in government. Otherwise, you will fail in government. What has Keir Starmer not had? That document. And I think it's really interesting that Kevin Roberts can come here, he can answer with clarity, agree or disagree with the policies about a set of proposals that as a whole create a story and a narrative about disruption and changing America for good, as in good people as well as for good economic outputs. And that is the thing that I think the right here in the UK is still struggling to find.
What I find amazing as well, considering where we were 5 to 10 years ago, voices on the right drowned out anyone who said something remotely controversial, even if it wasn't facing the threat of being cancelled. And what we're witnessing here is like a doubling down on people's beliefs. You said to Kevin, well, hang on, isn't the whole scrapping of DEI going to backfire? Oh, well, I'm just going to drink Liberals' tears on the back of that particular problem. It's basically, this is what we believe in, we're not going to be pushed around anymore. I mean, I'm wondering whether doubling down might backfire, or are they just going to just push ahead, juggernaut it through?
I think, Camilla, the effects of all these policies, we won't really know, will we, for a year or two, maybe 5 years, and that's going to be our job as journalists to hold them to account. But isn't it very similar what Kevin Roberts said to what Zia Youssef said, the chairman of Reform, to you when you asked about diversity and the lack of diversity in the leadership of Reform? He said, we don't care about diversity. Piers Morgan, he said Liberals are crying into their hankies. So the right now has the confidence to say, we don't care. What has been put in place on DEI is wrong. And you're right, there's a new style of confidence there, which the left has found almost impossible to respond to.
And on that note, we're going to be speaking to the Muslim woman who has been taking on the left, the Liberals, and indeed the Islamists. We're going to be speaking to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and it's well worth listening to.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, incredibly brave woman, Somalian, came to Europe in the 1990s, wrote very passionately about the appalling treatment of many, many millions of people, particularly women, under Islamic rule, has made powerful arguments about Islamism, Islamic extremism, often to her own personal danger. I kicked off, she's here at the ARC conference, I kicked off by asking her not just about liberalism, but about why Donald Trump won.
He won because for 77 million people, he made the impression that he was listening to them and that he was not a member of the ruling elite. And his MAGA, Make America Great Again, that slogan captures the idea of going back or emphasizing, making the nation state central to the addressing and resolving of national problems. And there's another slogan, America Fast, which I think also emphasizes that perspective. Now, if you live in Germany and you say Germany Fast, I think because of Germany's history, it makes a lot of people cringe and worry and panic. But because America is an idea and it's based on the Constitution and yes, Christian morality, it's much better, much easier to be a proud American because it's not based on skin color and it's not based on the sort of what I call bad nationalism. I think you can pursue and revive good nationalism, and I hope America becomes once again a force for good.
What do you make of what Trump has said about diversity, equity, and inclusion policies? He's basically suggested that they should be scrapped.
They should be scrapped, yeah. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are three wonderful sounding words that are in fact a scheme to do the exact opposite. It's to divide, and it's to create inequality. It's to revive racism, but this time against white people. It's all based on this idea that there's an oppressor and oppressed. It's what I call neo-communism, because the communism before 1989 failed. It was centered around class and economic inequality. But this DEI scheme is based on race and identity politics. And these things are terrible, and we've seen the outcome of that. So for the Trump administration to go out and say, let's get rid of this, I'm very much in favor of that. I'm also, I'd say, even more in favor of it, being black myself and being female and being an immigrant, because I think in the end, those types of divisive narratives use immigrants, use black people, use women to advance an agenda that is anti-woman. You've seen it with the transgender ideology that is racist. You've seen it with this elevating of people who are incompetent, in many ways entrenching prejudices against black people. And it's divisive. It's just awful. So I'm very happy that DEI is on its way out.
And do you think that policies like that are what attracted more people of colour to vote for Trump? Or do you think they were economically minded? Maybe they had many different reasons, but why do you think he managed to grow that section of his support?
He grew that section, African Americans and Hispanics, because they came to America, or they are American. They see themselves as African Americans are American. They want to be treated as individuals before the law. They don't want, in the case of African Americans, their neighborhoods and their towns flooded with immigrants from Haiti and from other places that are then given all sorts of material things that they don't have, they've been struggling to have. They don't want to be seen as a group. The Hispanics, I don't know if you followed some of the words that the woke use, Latinx, and Hispanics are mortified by that, appalled by the fact that they are identified as Latinx. They've come from places like Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico, failed states, communist states. They don't want a repeat of that. They're very much family-oriented. Many of them have small businesses and are entrepreneurial. And that's what they came to look for in America. They didn't want to be clustered in a group and be seen as victims and then used and abused for the agenda of neo-communists.
Do you think, Ian, that DEI has had any positive effects? I'm just very, very aware that, when I was a young man growing up, women had no positions of leadership in the UK. Very, very few women at the heads of businesses. Now, either they weren't capable or there was something structurally that needed to be challenged. And a lot of laws and regulations were passed in good faith that something needed to change. Otherwise, we would just keep repeating this idea that a certain type of white man was the only right leader. Mm-hmm. Is it that that's gone too far, or that wasn't the right approach in the first place?
I think the right approach for change is to argue for reform and to show with data that these inequalities exist, why they exist, and what ought to be done. But I think when you have an ideology masquerading as a social justice reform system, which it is not, then I don't see anything positive in DEI, perhaps against the fact that we are waking up to this subversive idea in our midst, what it's doing in schools and universities and in government, in other places. And so I'm very much motivated to fight it, wherever it is.
One of the other battles that you've had to your own threat has been around Islamic extremism. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and why that has brought you to the views that we need to focus much more on our Judeo-Christian heritage in the West and need to be ready to be brave in the face of Islamism.
Islamism, like DEI and like neo-communism, is collectivist in nature. It's a power-seeking narrative, and it seeks to use and abuse the people that it says it's defending, Muslims. If you look at the victims of Islamism, you will find that most of them are Muslims. And most Muslims are afraid to come out against it. Islamism has got 3 pillars if you want to fight it, and the first pillar, at least as it manifests itself in the West, is dawah. It is the process of using non-violence to spread its influence first among Muslims and then among non-Muslims. So it co-opts Muslims, claims to speak for all of them, which is not true, and then establishes mosques and other infrastructure like Islamic centers, and they're very active online. And so that is sort of to corral Muslims into adopting only the Islamist worldview. And then it seeks to Islamize the environment around it. They call it hollowing out the nation states, and they see it as a civilization. They're offering a civilizational alternative. So there's that gradual process. The second pillar is violence. The violence we see, sometimes people say, oh, lone wolf attacks and so on. There's nothing lone wolf about it. It's very much a calculated form of violence. And the third pillar is what they call Islamophobia. It is the censorship effort to make sure that no one asks questions about the ideology itself, their objectives, and the way they seek to achieve it. So once you understand those three pillars of Islamism, I think we'll be able to fight it with the tools we have, which is free speech, and which is the offer of a much better, more superior narrative of life, rather than the narrative of death that they offer.
In the past week, both Kamal and I have interviewed two different moderate Muslims who have been speaking about the dangers of the government's proposed Islamophobia definition. We spoke to Dr. Taj Hergi from the Oxford Institute of Islamic Studies. He said that he feared that this could introduce a blasphemy law by the back door. And I also spoke to the Emirati commentator Amjad Tahar, and he was saying that he felt that this was a license for fundamentalists to preach on British soil. Both of them seem to have identified Britain particularly of having a problem with Islamic extremism. Do you think that the UK does have a unique problem with this, and what are your solutions to solve it?
I think both gentlemen are absolutely correct. I know a little bit of Amjad's work, and he's been wonderful in waking up, or trying to wake up, Europeans in general and Britons in particular. What is it that is unique about Britain? I think that right now, Islamists, when they look at British society, they see that the white blood cells, if you were to think of society as an immune system, the immune system in Britain is very weak and in some cases non-existent. And the concept of liberalism has been replaced by license. And so they find it very, very, they have very favorable surroundings, an ecosystem where they can spread. That's the first pillar, the Islamization process, where they can, they have in this government of Keir Starmer a willing partner in the introduction of Islamophobia, so in the censorship, these blasphemy laws that they want to introduce. And they have a society, I think, that is cowed and demoralized. They could be wrong. I hope they are wrong. Every time I visit Britain, I find people, especially young people, who are more awake and attuned to what's going on. When I was last here, there were only 1,500 people at this Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. Now it's 4,500, and many of them are British. And so I don't really think that immune system is as weak as the Islamists think. It has been weak. It has been maybe too trusting. But I think it's time that the Brits now stand up and recalibrate.
Do you get the impression that the tide is turning? You mentioned the increased numbers here compared to last year. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes when we talk about people who defend freedom of speech, there's a sense that we're just talking about the boomer generation, people born before 1980. Mm-hmm. Actually, I think that there is a youth quake going on of younger people in Gen Z maybe rejecting some of what they appear to have been force-fed at school, university and beyond. What's your take on the younger generation?
Everywhere I go in the West, I see some members of the younger generation in trouble, in some places more than others. In the US, we are losing about 100,000 people every year to opioids, suicide, and so on. In some places, I see that things are better. Britain should be proud of the history of it and the legacy of its education system. And I find a lot of young people here who are capable of critical thinking. So when they try to force feed them these new ideologies, they sit up and ask questions, and that's a good thing. So I see, not the boomer, the British stereotype is they're horrified mostly of what's called embarrassment. And so a Brit would go very, very far to avoid embarrassment. And this young generation is seeing that notion of being embarrassed, sort of the Hugh Grant type of thing, that doesn't work anymore, and that they really should stand up and start expressing their displeasure with the boomer generation, with the new ideologies that are being introduced, and with great alarmism, the spread of Islamism here.
Camilla asked about solutions. What should British Muslims be doing here? Dr. Taj Hagi, he spoke about the liberal Muslims of the UK just not being aggressive enough with why they loved this country.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very interesting debate, that he said 15% of Muslims in Britain he thought were of the liberal persuasion, but just hadn't spoken up enough. Do you see any evidence that that could be a way of defeating this problem with our immune system, as you describe it?
Yes, I think Dr. Hagi has a point there, a very important point. When I joined these discussions 20 years ago, betraying my age now, 9/11/2001, there were very few individual Muslims who would actually come out and stand up and say, "Not in my name." But if he thinks that there are 15% of Britons, then I think there is an opportunity for them, for instance, to find an alliance with other groups that are threatened by Islamism, for instance, the Jewish communities, the working class communities, women, gay communities. There is a coalition here to be had that can fight both Islamism and wokeism at the same time.
I'm glad Ian there finished on a positive note, because it's all very well, some of the thinkers here, but if this movement is to continue having momentum, the movement of the so-called new right, I mean, are we calling it? Yeah. I know there are some old righties here, but we've got the emergence of some of these key figures, including Ian, and I think the appeal must be to the younger generation now. It must be for the younger generation to take this forward. And she actually seemed quite hopeful, particularly when it comes to moderate Muslims calling out the extremists in their midst. I mean, you would hope, wouldn't you, that younger generations can see this for what it is and just want to have more freedom, particularly younger Muslim women?
I think there is definitely a mood change. For me, it's around liberalism. For people like Ian, it's also around faith and Christianity. She spoke very powerfully about her own Christianity. She came from a Muslim background, and she now has the Christian faith. She quoted a lot from the Bible in her speech from the stage here today. But in terms of Islamic extremism, the interview we did last Friday, the interviews that you did over the weekend for GB News, I think shows that there are some voices now starting to be heard, and that's got to be a good journey.
Although I'm thinking about the religious element to this conference and some of the conversations on the right, particularly under Trump in America, and I'm also thinking the religious right in the UK need to be a bit careful, because we are more secular. I think the idea of being a sort of Bible-bashing righty that is anti-abortion is completely juxtaposed with Gen Z thinking. I mean, we talked a lot about the rise of the new right and young men wanting to vote for somebody like Nigel Farage, who's got this huge social media offering. Who are the inspirational figures on the right for young women to invest in and believe in? And I think if they're seen at all to be subjugating women in any way whatsoever, then they can't make that rational argument on the right for women's lib, for instance, when it comes to the extremist Islamic community. So there is a contradiction there. They've got to be careful.
I think, Camilla, they should be listening to you. You often challenge the leadership of Reform about their lack of diversity, not about diversity policies, but just their lack of diverse voices. Yeah. Reform would be hugely helped by a woman like Ayaan Hirsi Ali being in their leadership group.
Yes.
Someone who is black, female, but has all the arguments of the right. That is what they need to think about next in terms of their progression. I'm always reminded of Alistair Campbell's comment to Tony Blair about faith. Tony Blair was a Christian, and Campbell said to him, "We don't do God." And I still think there's some truth in that. There is a truth in the idea in the UK, we believe in values. There is faith very quietly in the background, but it's quite a quiet idea that we have. And we are mostly a liberal country. It was interesting. Kevin Roberts had that great phrase, didn't he? Waxwork Republicans, the old guard of Republicans. David Brooks, an academic who spoke here, has been described as a kind of centrist conservative. He was actually booed in there.
Yes.
There are things in America which aren't just lift and shift. I think one is faith, and I think second is sort of barracking and aggressive sort of punter arguments, which America loves, and it's very vibrant and aggressive. Here in the UK, we're less comfortable with that.
We like more nuance. And then I'm thinking, as you were describing how Ayan would be an asset to the reform movement, it then begs the question, why is Kemi Badenoch not cutting through enough? Because the woman I've just described that might appeal to right-wing Gen Zers is Badenoch. She's black. She's not ultra-religious. She's got a great history on feminism. She's fought the culture wars. She's pushed back against all of this transgender ideology. She has been a kind of beacon, frankly, for young black women in Britain. And yet, we have this polling, which we started with at the beginning of the podcast, reflecting that reform is surging ahead and that she is just not cutting through.
I mean, Kemi Badenoch has to make the Conservative Party the repository of all this vibrancy.
Yes.
What has happened so far is that Farage has beaten her in this race. He's started more quickly and more definitely. Kemi Badenoch has to believe, because it's her only policy now, that slow and steady will win the race. And just as we say to each other, Camilla, in a year's time, in 2 years' time, what is Trump going to be looking like? What is Farage going to be looking like? Kemi Badenoch must hope that her patience will work in her favour. She is being the unlucky politician at the moment. Yesterday, she was actually here making a speech about civilization, as we mentioned at the top of the podcast. It was on the day when Ukraine was everything. And sometimes in politics, if the luck isn't breaking for you, you do get lost. She's got to hope that the luck comes back her way.
Timing is certainly everything, and we've had a great day here.
We have. It's
surrounded
been,
by my people. Kamal, I've loved it.
Absolutely is.
Among
But
the righties.
as I said at the beginning of the podcast, it's difficult to see a left version of this event. The momentum, the energy, the intellectual thinking is all on the right at the moment, and that has got to make Keir Starmer and all those around him really worry.
More intellectual thinking on the right tomorrow, 5 p.m.